The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Captain Sarah Chen walked toward her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The familiar weight of her flight gear felt heavier today, though she couldn't explain why. Something in the air felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. Sarah had been flying the A-10 for 8 years, and every time she saw the aircraft, she felt the same surge of pride and affection. The Thunderbolt II wasn't pretty by conventional standards. Its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its straight wings, and its massive GAU-8 cannon gave it a brutish, ungainly appearance that earned it the nickname Warthog. But Sarah knew better. She knew that beneath that rough exterior lay the heart of a protector, a guardian angel for ground troops who found themselves in impossible situations. "Morning, Hawkeye," called out Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her crew chief, using her call sign. His weathered face broke into a grin as he approached with a clipboard in hand. "She's ready to go, ma'am. Did the full pre-flight myself?" Sarah nodded, running her hand along the aircraft's titanium belly. The A-10's designers had built it around the concept of survival. The titanium bathtub that surrounded the pilot could withstand direct hits from 23mm cannon fire. The redundant flight controls meant the aircraft could fly home even with significant battle damage. It was a flying tank, designed to get close to the enemy and bring hell down upon them while keeping its pilot alive. "What's the word from headquarters?" Sarah asked, accepting the clipboard and reviewing the maintenance log. Everything looked perfect, as always. Rodriguez took pride in his work, and it showed. "Same old story, Captain. Budget cuts, efficiency studies, politicians talking about modernization." Rodriguez's expression darkened slightly. "Heard some congressmen visited last week, asking questions about why we still need close air support when we have precision-guided munitions." Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The rumors had been circulating for months now. The A-10 program was under review. Again. Politicians and desk warriors who had never heard the sound of an A-10's cannon saving lives were questioning whether the aircraft was still relevant in modern warfare. They talked about cost per flight hour, about newer technologies, about the need to fund the latest generation of fighter aircraft. "They don't understand," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Rodriguez. "They've never been down there, waiting for help to arrive." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "My son's infantry, ma'am. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan. He always said the most beautiful sound in the world was hearing a warthog overhead when things got hairy. Said it meant someone was watching out for him." Sarah climbed into the cockpit, going through her pre-flight ritual with the same methodical precision she'd maintained for thousands of hours. Every switch, every gauge, every system had to be perfect. Lives depended on it. As she ran through her checklist, memories flooded back of missions where the dedication to detail had made the difference between life and death. She remembered a mission 2 years ago in eastern Afghanistan. A convoy of Marines had been ambushed in a narrow valley, pinned down by enemy fire from concealed positions in the rocky terrain. The enemy had chosen their spot well, using the terrain to make it nearly impossible for conventional aircraft to engage effectively. But the A-10 was different. Sarah had been able to get low, slow, and precise, using the aircraft's incredible maneuverability and the pilot's ability to visually acquire targets to systematically eliminate each threat. The mission had taken 3 hours. 3 hours of circling, identifying targets, coordinating with ground forces, and delivering precise fire. By the time it was over, every Marine in that convoy had made it home alive. Sarah had received a commendation for the mission, but the real reward had come weeks later when she received a letter from a Marine corporal thanking her for saving his life. He'd included a photo of his newborn daughter, born just days after his return home. That was what the politicians didn't understand. The A-10 wasn't just about specifications and cost analysis. It was about bringing people home. It was about providing a level of close air support that no other aircraft could match. The F-16s were fast and versatile, the F-22s were stealthy and deadly, but when soldiers needed help right now, when they needed an aircraft that could loiter overhead for hours and deliver precise firepower in close proximity to friendly forces, there was only one choice. Tower, Hawkeye 1 requesting taxi clearance, Sarah called into her radio as she completed her checklist. Hawkeye 1, cleared to taxi runway 27. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Have a good hunt out there. The tower controller's voice carried the same warmth that Sarah heard from everyone who worked with A-10 pilots. There was a mutual respect and understanding of the mission that went beyond professional courtesy. Everyone at Bugram had either seen the A-10 in action or knew someone whose life had been saved by one. As Sarah taxied toward the runway, she passed a group of F-16 fighting Falcons parked on the opposite side of the airfield. The sleek fighters gleamed in the morning sun, their swept wings and streamlined fuselages representing the cutting edge of aviation technology. They were beautiful aircraft, no doubt about it, and their pilots were skilled and dedicated professionals. But, as Sarah looked at them, she couldn't help but think about the fundamental difference in philosophy they represented. The F-16 was designed for speed and agility, built to engage enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat or to deliver precision strikes from high altitude. It was a thoroughbred racehorse, elegant and fast but requiring careful handling and ideal conditions to perform at its best. The A-10, by contrast, was a workhorse. It was designed to operate in the worst possible conditions, to take punishment and keep flying, to get down in the dirt with the ground troops and provide the kind of intimate, personal protection that only came from having a pilot who could see the battlefield with their own eyes. Hawkeye 1, you're cleared for takeoff. Contact departure on 124.7. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge as the twin TF-34 engines spooled up to full power. The A-10 didn't leap into the air like a fighter jet. It climbed steadily, purposefully, like a predator taking its time to survey the territory below. As the landing gear retracted and Sarah settled into her climb, she felt the same sense of purpose that had driven her every day for the past 8 years. Today's mission was a training exercise, but Sarah approached it with the same intensity she brought to combat operations. The exercise scenario involved close air support for a simulated convoy under attack. Sarah would be working with ground controllers to identify and engage targets while avoiding friendly forces in a complex, dynamic environment. But, as Sarah leveled off at her assigned altitude and began coordinating with the exercise controllers, something felt different. There was an unusual amount of radio chatter, and several times she heard references to special observers and evaluation protocols. When she asked for clarification, the responses were vague and non-committal. 20 minutes into the exercise, Sarah received an unexpected radio call. Hawkeye 1, this is Viper 1. We're being vectored to join your exercise as additional assets. Sarah frowned. Viper was an F-16 call sign, and F-16s weren't typically used in close air support training exercises. Their pilots were trained primarily for air-to-air combat and high-altitude precision strikes, not the kind of low-altitude, eyes-on-target work that characterized A-10 operations. Viper 1, Hawkeye 1. Copy that. What's your configuration and mission parameters? Hawkeye 1, we're carrying training ordnance, configured for close air support. We've been tasked to observe and participate in the exercise. The tone in the F-16 pilot's voice was professional but slightly uncertain. Sarah had heard that tone before, usually from pilots who were being asked to operate outside their primary area of expertise. She felt a pang of sympathy for the Viper pilots, even as she wondered what kind of evaluation was really taking place. As the exercise progressed, Sarah found herself working alongside two F-16s in scenarios that seemed designed to highlight the differences between the aircraft. The F-16s approached each target from high altitude, using their sophisticated targeting systems to identify and engage threats with precision-guided munitions. They were fast and efficient, able to cover large areas quickly and deliver accurate strikes. But, when the exercise shifted to more complex scenarios involving close proximity to friendly forces, Sarah began to notice the limitations of the F-16 approach. The fighter jets had to maintain higher altitudes and faster speeds, making it difficult for their pilots to develop the detailed situational awareness that close air support required. Their sophisticated sensors could identify targets, but they couldn't replicate the human judgment that came from actually seeing the battlefield. During one particularly challenging scenario, the ground controllers simulated a situation where friendly forces were engaged in close combat with enemy troops in an urban environment. The targets were close together, the situation was fluid, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Sarah brought her A-10 down to 500 feet, slow enough that she could visually confirm each target before engaging. She could see the simulated friendly forces marked with orange panels, could identify the specific buildings where enemy forces were supposedly located, could even make out individual vehicles and equipment on the ground. The A-10's large canopy and excellent visibility gave her an unobstructed view of the battlefield, while the aircraft's slow speed allowed her to take the time necessary to ensure accuracy. The F-16 pilots, operating from higher altitude and faster speeds, struggled with the same scenario. Their targeting systems were sophisticated, but they couldn't provide the nuanced understanding of the battlefield that came from low-altitude visual observation. After several attempts, both Viper pilots admitted they couldn't confidently engage the targets without risking friendly fire. Hawkeye 1, this is Viper lead. We're having difficulty with visual confirmation at this altitude. Can you provide target talk-on? Sarah felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and deep sadness. She was proud of her aircraft and her abilities, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this entire exercise was really an evaluation designed to justify a decision that had already been made. The way the scenarios were structured, the presence of the F-16s, the unusual radio chatter about observers and evaluations, it all pointed to one conclusion. They were trying to prove that the F-16 could replace the A-10 in the close air support role. As the exercise concluded and Sarah began her return flight to Bagram, she found herself thinking about all the soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors who had depended on A-10 pilots over the years. She thought about the thank you letters she'd received, the commendations that cited lives saved, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her skills and her aircraft had made a difference in the most critical moments. The radio crackled to life as she approached the airfield. Hawkeye 1, Bagram Tower. You're cleared to land runway 27. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Tower, Hawkeye 1. Cleared to land 27. As Sarah lined up for her approach, she noticed something unusual. There were more people than normal gathered near the flight line, and several official-looking vehicles were parked near the operations building. As she touched down and taxied toward her parking spot, she could see that many of the people were wearing dress uniforms rather than flight suits. Rodriguez was waiting for her as she shut down the engines, but his usual cheerful demeanor was nowhere to be seen. His face was grim, and he avoided making eye contact as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit. "How'd she fly today, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, though she could tell from Rodriguez's expression that something was wrong. "Like a dream, ma'am. Like always." Rodriguez paused, then looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen before. "Captain, there's something you need to know. Colonel Williams wants to see you in his office as soon as you're done with your post-flight." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Colonel Williams was the wing commander, and being summoned to his office immediately after a training flight was unusual, to say the least. "Any idea what it's about, Sergeant?" Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Nothing official, ma'am. But there's been a lot of brass around here today. People in suits, too. And I heard some of the maintainers talking about receiving new aircraft assignments." Sarah nodded, though her mind was racing. She completed her post-flight inspection mechanically, going through the motions while her thoughts churned. By the time she finished and headed toward the operations building, she was fairly certain she knew what Colonel Williams wanted to discuss. The walk across the flight line had never seemed longer. With each step, Sarah felt as though she was walking toward the end of something precious, something irreplaceable. The A-10 behind her represented more than just an aircraft. It represented a philosophy of warfare that put the protection of ground troops above all else, a commitment to being there when people needed help most, regardless of the cost or the risk. As she approached the operations building, Sarah paused for a moment to look back at her aircraft. In the afternoon sun, the Warthog looked exactly like what it was, a flying tank, ugly and utilitarian and absolutely perfect for its mission. She wondered if this might be the last time she would see it as her aircraft, the last time she would feel that sense of pride and purpose that came from knowing she was part of something bigger than herself. The door to the operations building seemed heavier than usual as Sarah pulled it open and stepped inside. The hallways were quieter than normal, and she noticed that several offices that were usually bustling with activity appeared to be empty. As she approached Colonel Williams' office, she could hear voices inside, multiple people engaged in what sounded like a serious discussion. Sarah straightened her shoulders and knocked on the doorframe. "Enter," came Colonel Williams' voice from inside. Sarah stepped into the office and immediately understood that her instincts had been correct. Colonel Williams was seated behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Two men in civilian clothes sat in chairs facing the desk, their briefcases and serious expressions marking them clearly as government officials. Standing near the window was another officer Sarah recognized as General Morrison from Wing Headquarters. "Captain Chen, please have a seat," Colonel Williams said, gesturing to an empty chair. His voice carried a weight that Sarah had never heard before. As Sarah sat down, she noticed that one of the civilians was reviewing a thick folder that bore her name on the tab. The other was studying what appeared to be a detailed analysis of the day's training exercise, complete with charts and graphs that tracked various performance metrics. Captain Chen, Colonel Williams began, "I'm sure you're wondering why you've been called here today. I want you to know that this meeting is not a reflection on your performance or your dedication. Your record speaks for itself, and you're one of the finest pilots I've had the privilege to serve with." Sarah felt her stomach drop. In her experience, conversations that began with praise were rarely followed by good news. General Morrison stepped forward from his position by the window. "Captain, I'm going to be direct with you because you deserve to know the truth. The Department of Defense has made a decision regarding the future of the A-10 program. After extensive analysis and consideration of budget constraints, operational requirements, and technological advances, the decision has been made to retire the A-10 fleet over the next 18 months. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been expecting this moment for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that all the rumors and speculation never had. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "may I ask what aircraft will be assuming the close air support mission?" One of the civilians spoke for the first time. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, with upgraded targeting systems and specialized training for close air support operations, will assume primary responsibility for the mission. Our analysis indicates that the F-16's versatility and modern avionics make it a more cost-effective solution for current and future operational requirements. Sarah felt a surge of anger that she fought to keep under control. She thought about the exercise she'd just completed, about the F-16 pilot's struggles with the close air support scenarios, about all the times she'd been able to provide support that no other aircraft could match. "With respect, sir," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "today's exercise demonstrated some significant differences in capability between the A-10 and the F-16 in the close air support role. The F-16 pilots, despite their skill and professionalism, had difficulty with visual target identification and close proximity operations." General Morrison nodded. "We're aware of the challenges, Captain. That's why there will be an extensive training program to prepare F-16 pilots for their expanded role. Additionally, technological advances in targeting systems and precision-guided munitions will help bridge any capability gaps." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that technology couldn't replace the human element of close air support, that sensors and computers couldn't provide the judgment and situational awareness that came from actually seeing the battlefield. But she could tell from the expressions around her that the decision was final and that her arguments would fall on deaf ears. Colonel Williams leaned forward. "Sarah, I know this is difficult news. But I want you to know that we value your expertise, and we're hoping you'll consider transitioning to the F-16 program. Your experience in close air support would be invaluable in developing training protocols and operational procedures for the F-16 pilots who will be taking over this mission." Sarah felt numb. The idea of training F-16 pilots to do what A-10 pilots had been perfecting for decades seemed almost surreal. It was like asking a master craftsman to teach someone to use a machine to replicate handmade work, technically possible, perhaps, but something essential would be lost in the translation. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I need some time to consider my options," Sarah said finally. "Of course," General Morrison replied. "This is a significant change for everyone involved. You have 30 days to decide whether you want to transition to the F-16 program or explore other assignments within the Air Force." As the meeting concluded and Sarah found herself walking back across the flight line, the afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The A-10 sat in exactly the same spot where she'd left it, unchanged and seemingly eternal, but Sarah knew that its days were numbered. She thought about all the pilots who had flown the A-10 before her, about the soldiers whose lives had been saved by the aircraft's unique capabilities, about the mission that had defined her career and given her life purpose. In 18 months, it would all be over. The Warthog would be retired, its pilots scattered to other aircraft and other missions, its legacy reduced to statistics and budget analyses. But, as Sarah stood there in the gathering dusk, watching the maintenance crews prepare her aircraft for the night, she made a decision. Whatever happened in the next 18 months, she would continue to fly the A-10 with the same dedication and skill she had always brought to the mission. Every flight would matter, every training exercise would be an opportunity to demonstrate what the aircraft could do, every moment would be a chance to honor the legacy of all the A-10 pilots who had come before her. The battle for the A-10 might be over, but Sarah Chen was far from finished fighting. 3 months had passed since the announcement, and the atmosphere at Bugram had changed dramatically. Where once there had been the comfortable routine of experienced A-10 squadrons, now there was an undercurrent of uncertainty and transition. Sarah had watched as some of her fellow pilots accepted transfers to other aircraft, while others chose to leave the Air Force entirely rather than abandon their beloved Warthogs. Sarah had made her own choice. She would stay with the A-10 until the very end, training the next generation of close air support pilots even as she knew they would be flying different aircraft. It was a bittersweet mission, but one she felt compelled to complete. The morning briefing room was more crowded than usual as Sarah entered. Along with the familiar faces of A-10 pilots, she could see several F-16 pilots who had been assigned to cross-training duties. Among them was Captain Jake Razor Morrison, a hotshot F-16 pilot with an impressive record in air-to-air combat. Sarah had heard about Morrison from other pilots. He was known for his aggressive flying style and his confidence in the superiority of modern fighter aircraft. "Good morning, everyone," announced Major Patricia Wells, who had been assigned to oversee the transition training program. "Today we're going to be conducting a comprehensive evaluation exercise involving both A-10 and F-16 aircraft in various close air support scenarios. The goal is to establish baseline performance metrics and identify areas where additional training may be needed." Sarah noticed Morrison roll his eyes slightly at the mention of additional training. She had encountered this attitude before among fighter pilots who viewed close air support as a secondary mission, something that could be easily learned by pilots who had mastered air-to-air combat. It was a dangerous misconception, one that could have deadly consequences in real-world operations. "Captain Chen," Major Wells continued, "you'll be leading the A-10 element and providing guidance to our F-16 pilots as they work through the scenarios. Captain Morrison will be leading the F-16 element." As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself studying the F-16 pilots' faces. Most seemed eager and professional, genuinely interested in learning the nuances of close air support. But Morrison's expression remained skeptical, as if he was humoring superiors who didn't understand that modern technology had made the A-10's methods obsolete. The first scenario involved supporting a ground patrol that had been ambushed in mountainous terrain. The enemy forces were positioned in caves and rocky outcroppings that provided natural camouflage and protection. It was exactly the kind of situation where the A-10's capabilities shined: low-altitude operations, visual target identification, and the ability to loiter overhead for extended periods. Sarah took her A-10 down to 800 feet, well below the altitude that most aircraft would consider safe in mountainous terrain. But the A-10 had been designed for this kind of work, and Sarah had the experience to make it look routine. As she circled the target area, she could clearly see the simulated friendly forces marked with orange panels, as well as the locations where enemy forces were supposedly hidden. "Ground control, Hawkeye 1. I have visual on friendly positions and am beginning target identification. Stand by." Sarah spent the next 10 minutes methodically examining each potential target location. The A-10's large canopy provided excellent visibility, and its slow speed allowed her to take the time necessary to ensure accuracy. She could see details that would be invisible from higher altitudes: the way shadows fell across rocky ledges, the subtle signs that indicated human presence, the exact positioning of friendly forces relative to potential targets. "Ground control, Hawkeye 1. I have identified 3 confirmed target locations. Requesting clearance to engage. Hawkeye 1, ground control. You are cleared hot on all 3 targets. Friendlies are marked and accounted for." Sarah's simulated attack runs were precise and deliberate. Each pass allowed her to approach from a different angle, ensuring that she could engage targets without putting friendly forces at risk. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon was designed for exactly this kind of precision work, capable of placing rounds within feet of friendly positions when operated by an experienced pilot. "Ground control, Hawkeye 1. All targets destroyed. Friendlies remain secure. I'll maintain overhead coverage while Viper element conducts their runs." Morrison's voice came through the radio with the casual confidence that Sarah had expected. "Ground control, Viper 1. We'll conduct high-altitude precision strikes on the target locations. Stand by for coordinates." Sarah watched from her lower altitude as the 2 F-16s positioned themselves for their attack runs. They were operating from 15,000 feet, well above the terrain but also well above the altitude where visual target identification was possible. Instead, they were relying on their sophisticated targeting systems and GPS coordinates provided by ground controllers. The first F-16 made its run, releasing a simulated precision-guided munition toward the coordinates of the first target. The system indicated a direct hit, and, by the technical standards of the exercise, the mission was successful. But Sarah could see something that the F-16 pilot couldn't. Viper 1, Hawkeye 1. Be advised that your target coordinates appear to be approximately 50 meters off from the actual enemy position. The munition would have impacted in an area with no military significance. There was a pause before Morrison responded. Hawkeye 1, Viper 1. Our targeting system shows a direct hit on provided coordinates. Exercise controllers confirm successful engagement. Sarah felt a familiar frustration. The exercise controllers were tracking simulated positions based on GPS coordinates, not actual visual confirmation. In the computer system that managed the exercise, Morrison's attack had been successful. But, in reality, if there had been actual enemy forces in those caves, they would still be alive and dangerous. Viper 1, this is Hawkeye 1. I understand your systems show a successful hit, but, from my position I can see that the actual terrain features don't match the coordinates. This is why visual confirmation is so important in close air support operations. Morrison's response carried a note of irritation. Hawkeye 1, precision-guided munitions don't require visual confirmation when we have accurate GPS data. This is exactly the kind of technological advancement that makes low-altitude operations unnecessary. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. She knew that getting into an argument over the radio would only create problems, but she also couldn't let such a dangerous misunderstanding go unchallenged. Viper 1, I respect the capability of your systems, but GPS coordinates can be affected by terrain features, atmospheric conditions, and human error in the spotting process. Visual confirmation provides a backup that can prevent fratricide and ensure mission success. The exercise continued with Morrison's element conducting their remaining simulated strikes. Each time, their targeting systems indicated successful hits, but Sarah could see that several of the attacks were missing their intended targets by margins that would have been tactically significant in actual combat. When the exercise concluded and both flights returned to base, Sarah found herself thinking about the fundamental disconnect she had witnessed. The F-16 pilots were skilled professionals using sophisticated equipment, but they were approaching close air support with the same mindset they brought to air-to-air combat or strategic bombing. They trusted their technology implicitly and saw no need for the kind of intimate battlefield awareness that defined A-10 operations. After debriefing, Sarah was surprised when Morrison approached her near the flight line. His expression was less confident than it had been during the briefing, and she could see that something about the exercise had given him pause. Captain Chen, can I ask you something? Morrison began, his tone more respectful than she had expected. During the exercise, you seemed pretty certain about the target locations. How could you tell that our coordinates were off? Sarah gestured toward her A-10, which was being serviced by Rodriguez and his team. It's not magic, Captain. It's just a matter of being able to see what you're shooting at. From 800 feet, I could see the actual cave entrances, the positions where someone would logically place defensive positions, the terrain features that provided cover and concealment. Your coordinates were based on someone else's assessment passed through multiple communication links. Even small errors compound quickly in that kind of chain. Morrison nodded slowly. But our targeting systems are accurate to within meters. Shouldn't that be sufficient? In many cases, yes, Sarah replied. But close air support isn't like shooting at a building or a vehicle in open terrain. You're often dealing with concealed positions, complex terrain, and rapidly changing situations. The difference between hitting a target and missing it can literally be the difference between life and death for the people on the ground. As they talked, Rodriguez approached with a clipboard. Captain Chen, the post-flight inspection is complete. She's ready for tomorrow's operations. He glanced at Morrison with curiosity but didn't interrupt the conversation. Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah said, this is Captain Morrison. He's one of the F-16 pilots who'll be taking over close air support missions. Rodriguez extended his hand with a friendly smile, but Sarah noticed a slight reserve in his manner. Pleased to meet you, sir. Hope the transition goes smoothly for everyone. Morrison shook Rodriguez's hand, then looked back at the A-10 with what appeared to be newfound interest. Sergeant, how long have you been working on these aircraft? 15 years, sir. Started as an apprentice right out of tech school. Worked on A-10s in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and half a dozen other places where people needed help. What's your opinion of the aircraft's capabilities? Morrison asked, and Sarah was surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice. Rodriguez's expression became more animated. Sir, I've seen this aircraft come back from missions with holes you could put your fist through, hydraulic system shot out, engines damaged, landing gear barely functional. And she still brought her pilot home. I've seen A-10 pilots provide cover for ground troops in situations where other aircraft couldn't even operate because of weather, terrain, or enemy fire. Morrison listened intently as Rodriguez continued. It's not just about the aircraft, though. It's about the pilots and the mission. A-10 pilots train for one thing, keeping ground troops alive. Everything else is secondary. When you specialize in something that's specific, you get really good at it. After Rodriguez returned to his duties, Morrison and Sarah continued their conversation. Captain Chen, I have to admit that today's exercise was more challenging than I expected. The scenarios you handled seemed straightforward, but when we tried to engage the same targets from higher altitude, there were complications I hadn't anticipated. Sarah appreciated Morrison's honesty. Close air support looks simple from the outside, but it's actually one of the most complex missions in military aviation. You're not just flying an aircraft and employing weapons. You're integrating with ground forces, interpreting a constantly changing tactical situation, and making split-second decisions that directly impact human lives. How long did it take you to become proficient at this kind of work? Morrison asked. I'd say it took about 2 years of regular operations before I really felt confident in complex scenarios, Sarah replied. And I'm still learning. Every mission teaches you something new about the capabilities of the aircraft and the nuances of the mission. Morrison's expression became troubled. 2 years? But the transition timeline calls for F-16 pilots to assume close air support duties within 6 months of beginning the training program. Sarah felt her heart sink. 6 months was nowhere near enough time to develop the expertise that effective close air support required, especially for pilots whose background was in air-to-air combat. It was a recipe for disaster, and she could only imagine the consequences when these inadequately trained pilots found themselves supporting troops in actual combat. Captain Morrison, 6 months will give you basic familiarity with the procedures and equipment. But developing the judgment and intuition that allows you to operate effectively in complex, high-stress situations takes much longer. It's like the difference between knowing how to drive a car and being able to race professionally. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of aircraft engines starting up across the flight line. Sarah looked over to see several F-16s preparing for departure, their sleek profiles gleaming in the afternoon sun. She couldn't help but admire them as aircraft, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching the wrong tool being prepared for a job it wasn't designed to handle. Captain Chen, Morrison said after a moment, would you be willing to provide some additional training for our pilots? I mean beyond what's in the official curriculum. It's clear that there are aspects of close air support that aren't adequately covered in our regular F-16 training. Sarah looked at Morrison with new respect. It took courage for a pilot to admit that his aircraft and training might not be adequate for a mission, especially when that admission contradicted official policy. I'd be happy to help, Captain. But understand that what I can teach you in a few training flights is just the beginning. Real expertise in close air support comes from years of experience and hundreds of missions. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself working closely with Morrison and the other F-16 pilots assigned to the transition program. They were eager students, and she was impressed by their willingness to acknowledge the limitations of their experience and equipment. But, with each training flight, she became more convinced that the decision to retire the A-10 was a tragic mistake. During one particularly challenging exercise, Sarah watched as Morrison struggled to provide effective support to a simulated ground unit that was engaged in close combat with enemy forces. The F-16's speed and altitude requirements made it difficult for him to maintain situational awareness, and his sophisticated targeting systems couldn't compensate for his lack of visual contact with the battlefield. After the exercise, Morrison approached Sarah with obvious frustration. I've been thinking about our earlier conversation about expertise and training time. What you described as a 2-year learning curve, is that really necessary, or is it just a matter of different approaches to the same mission? Sarah considered her response carefully. Captain, let me ask you a question. How long did it take you to become truly proficient in air-to-air combat? Morrison thought for a moment. Honestly? About 3 years. The basic skills came fairly quickly, but learning to think tactically, to anticipate what an opponent was going to do, to react instinctively in high-stress situations, that took much longer. Close air support is the same way, Sarah explained. The basic procedures can be learned relatively quickly, but developing the ability to read a complex battlefield, to coordinate effectively with ground forces, to make accurate target identification decisions under pressure, that's a different level of expertise entirely. Morrison nodded slowly. And there's no way to accelerate that learning process? Not without accepting significantly higher risk, Sarah replied. You can train someone to follow procedures in 6 months. But procedures don't cover every situation you'll encounter in actual combat. Real expertise comes from experience, from making mistakes in training and learning from them, from developing the intuition that allows you to know when to trust your instruments and when to trust your eyes. As their conversation continued, Sarah found herself thinking about all the young pilots who would be attempting to fill the A-10's role with inadequate training and inappropriate aircraft. She thought about the ground troops who would be depending on these pilots for protection, trusting their lives to people who were being set up to fail through no fault of their own. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters writing a letter to her sister back home. She found it difficult to explain the emotions she was experiencing as she watched the gradual dismantling of everything she had devoted her career to building. The hardest part, she wrote, isn't that they're retiring the A-10. Aircraft come and go, and I understand that military equipment eventually becomes obsolete. The hardest part is watching them replace something that works with something that doesn't, and knowing that people are going to die because of that decision. Sarah paused in her writing, staring out the window at the flight line where her A-10 sat silently in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring another day of training exercises, another opportunity to demonstrate what the aircraft could do, another small battle in a war that had already been lost. But, as she finished her letter and prepared for sleep, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Even if the A-10's days were numbered, even if the mission would soon be assigned to pilots flying inappropriate aircraft with inadequate training, she could still make a difference. Every F-16 pilot she could teach, every technique she could pass on, every lesson she could impart might someday save lives when those pilots found themselves supporting troops in actual combat. It wasn't the legacy she had hoped to leave, but it was better than giving up entirely. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah held onto a small hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually recognize the magnitude of the mistake that was being made and find a way to correct it before it was too late. The morning of September 15th started like any other, with Sarah reviewing weather reports and mission briefings over her coffee. But, as she walked toward the flight line, she noticed an unusual amount of activity around the communications center. Several officers were moving with the kind of urgent purpose that indicated something significant had happened overnight. Rodriguez met her at the aircraft with a grim expression. Captain, there's been a situation. Real world, not an exercise. Marine Patrol got hit hard about 60 clicks northeast of here. They're requesting immediate close air support. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the transition from training to actual combat operations. What's the tactical situation? Patrol of 12 Marines conducting a reconnaissance mission was ambushed at dawn. They're pinned down in rocky terrain with at least 20 enemy fighters in prepared positions. Limited cover, low on ammunition, and they've got 2 wounded who can't move under their own power. Sarah was already moving toward her aircraft as Rodriguez continued the briefing. Weather's marginal with low clouds and mountain winds. F-16s were scrambled initially but couldn't get low enough to identify targets due to weather conditions. Ground control specifically requested A-10 support. As Sarah began her pre-flight inspection, she could see 2 F-16s returning to base in the distance. The sight filled her with a mixture of vindication and sadness. The very first real-world test of the transition plan, and the F-16s had been unable to complete the mission. Any word on enemy capabilities? Sarah asked as she climbed into the cockpit. Standard small arms and RPGs, but they've got the Marines in a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. Classic ambush setup using terrain to their advantage. Sarah's hands moved through the startup sequence with the automatic precision of thousands of hours of practice. The twin engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and, within minutes she was ready for takeoff. As she taxied toward the runway, she noticed Morrison standing near the F-16 flight line, his expression unreadable as he watched her departure. The flight to the target area took 25 minutes, during which Sarah coordinated with ground controllers and reviewed the tactical situation. The Marines had been conducting what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission when they stumbled into a carefully prepared ambush. The enemy had chosen their ground well, using natural rock formations to create protected firing positions while forcing the Marines into open terrain with minimal cover. Hawkeye 1, this is Groundhog 6, came the voice of the Marine ground controller. His tone was professional but strained, and Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire in the background. "We've got 12 Marines pinned down in Grid Square Alpha 7. 2 urgent casualties, 1 critical. Enemy forces are in concealed positions on the ridgeline to our north and west. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. I'm 5 minutes out. Can you mark your position and provide target orientation?" Hawkeye 1, we're marking our position with orange smoke. Enemy positions are approximately 200 meters north and 150 meters west of our location. Be advised, they've got RPGs and have been shooting at everything that flies over. As Sarah approached the target area, she could immediately see why the F-16s had been unable to complete the mission. The cloud ceiling was down to about 1,500 feet, and the mountainous terrain created wind conditions that would have made high-altitude precision strikes extremely difficult. More importantly, the enemy positions were so well concealed that they would have been nearly impossible to identify from high altitude. Sarah brought her A-10 down to 800 feet, well below the cloud deck and low enough for detailed visual reconnaissance. Almost immediately, she began taking small arms fire from the enemy positions, but the A-10's armored cockpit and redundant systems were designed to operate in exactly this kind of hostile environment. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. I have visual on your orange smoke and am beginning target identification. I can see muzzle flashes from at least 4 enemy positions. Stand by while I develop the situation. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah circled the area at low altitude, carefully mapping each enemy position while taking occasional fire from below. The A-10's slow speed and excellent visibility allowed her to build a detailed picture of the tactical situation that would have been impossible from higher altitude or faster speeds. She could see that the enemy had positioned fighters in 3 main groups. The first group was on a rocky ledge about 200 meters north of the Marine position, with a clear field of fire down into the area where the Marines had taken cover. The second group was in a cluster of boulders to the northwest, positioned to catch anyone trying to move up the slope for better cover. The third group was in what appeared to be a natural cave opening to the west, protected from most angles of attack but with a clear shot at the Marine position. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. I've identified 3 main enemy positions. I'm going to start with the group that has the clearest shot at your location, then work systematically through the others. Keep your heads down and be ready to move your casualties when I tell you. Sarah's first attack run came in from the east, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last moment. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon opened up with its distinctive roar, sending 30mm rounds into the rocky ledge where the primary enemy group was positioned. The cannon's accuracy was devastating at close range, and Sarah could see debris flying from the impact area as her rounds found their targets. Enemy return fire was immediate and intense. Sarah could hear rounds impacting her aircraft, but the A-10's titanium armor and redundant systems kept her in the fight. As she pulled up from her first pass, she could see that the primary enemy position had been neutralized, but the other 2 groups were now concentrating their fire on her aircraft. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. First group is down. I'm taking fire from the other positions but continuing attack. How are your casualties? Hawkeye 1, outstanding work. Casualties are stable but we need to get them out of here. Can you clear the other positions? Sarah lined up for her second attack run, this time approaching from the south to engage the group in the boulder field. This was a more difficult target, as the enemy fighters had spread out among the rocks and were using natural cover effectively. Sarah had to make multiple passes, carefully placing her fire to avoid hitting the areas where Marines might be taking cover while systematically eliminating each individual target. The third enemy position proved to be the most challenging. The cave opening provided excellent protection from most angles of attack, and the fighters inside were able to keep up a steady stream of fire while remaining largely protected. Sarah tried several different approach angles, but each time she was met with intense fire from the cave mouth without being able to achieve decisive results. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. I'm having trouble with the cave position. They've got good cover and I can't get the angle I need without putting myself in an extremely vulnerable position. Hawkeye 1, understand. Is there anything we can do to help with targeting? Sarah circled the area again, studying the terrain and thinking through her options. Then, she noticed something that the higher altitude perspective of an F-16 would never have revealed. There was a secondary opening to the cave system, visible only from a very low angle and only if you knew what to look for. Groundhog 6, I think I've got a solution. There's a back door to that cave system. I'm going to try a different approach. Stand by. Sarah's final attack run was her most dangerous yet. She had to approach from the northwest, flying directly over known enemy positions at extremely low altitude to get the angle she needed on the secondary cave opening. Enemy fire was intense, and she could feel her aircraft taking hits, but the A-10's ability to absorb punishment kept her mission capable. The GAU-8 cannon found its mark, and Sarah watched as her rounds entered the secondary cave opening and ricocheted through the interior. The firing from the cave mouth stopped abruptly, and she could see debris and dust billowing from both openings. Groundhog 6, Hawkeye 1. All enemy positions neutralized. You should be clear to move your casualties. I'll maintain overhead cover while you extract. Hawkeye 1, Groundhog 6. Outstanding work. We're moving now. Thanks for saving our lives. As Sarah circled overhead watching the Marines move their wounded to a landing zone where a medical helicopter could extract them, she felt the satisfaction that came from knowing her skills and her aircraft had made the difference between life and death for 12 fellow servicemen. But she also felt a deep sadness, knowing that missions like this would soon be impossible when the A-10 was retired. The return flight to Bagram was uneventful, though Sarah could feel that her aircraft had taken significant damage during the engagement. The A-10's robust design meant that she was still fully mission capable, but there would be extensive repairs needed before the next flight. Rodriguez was waiting for her as she shut down the engines, and his expression was a mixture of pride and concern as he began his post-flight inspection. "How'd she handle, Captain?" Rodriguez asked as he examined bullet holes in the aircraft's wing. "Like a champ, as always," Sarah replied. "Took some hits, but nothing she couldn't handle." As Rodriguez continued his inspection, counting impact sites and checking for damage to critical systems, Sarah found herself thinking about the mission that had just concluded. Everything about the engagement had played to the A-10's strengths: low-altitude operations in challenging weather, visual target identification in complex terrain, close coordination with ground forces, and the ability to absorb battle damage while continuing the mission. An F-16 pilot, no matter how skilled or well-intentioned, could never have completed this mission successfully. The weather conditions alone would have prevented the high-altitude precision strikes that F-16s relied upon, and the complex terrain and concealed targets would have made visual identification nearly impossible from higher altitudes. "Captain Chen, you need to see this," Rodriguez called out from the far side of the aircraft. Sarah walked around to find Rodriguez staring at a section of the fuselage where several large-caliber rounds had impacted. The titanium armor had done its job, stopping the rounds from penetrating to vital systems, but the damage was impressive even by A-10 standards. "If this had been any other aircraft, you wouldn't be standing here right now," Rodriguez said quietly. "These rounds would have gone straight through to the engine bay or fuel system." As they completed their inspection and began the paperwork for the damage assessment, Sarah noticed Morrison approaching from across the flight line. His expression was subdued, and she could tell that the day's events had affected him deeply. "Captain Chen," Morrison began, "I heard about your mission today. 12 Marines extracted safely, minimal friendly casualties, all enemy positions neutralized." Sarah nodded. "It was a good day. The aircraft performed exactly as designed, and the Marines are going home to their families." Morrison looked at the battle damage on Sarah's aircraft, then back at her. "The F-16s that were initially scrambled, I was the flight leader. We couldn't get below the weather, couldn't identify the targets, couldn't provide the kind of precise support the Marines needed." "Different aircraft, different capabilities," Sarah replied diplomatically. "The F-16 is an excellent aircraft for many missions. But not this one," Morrison said bluntly. "Not any mission like this one. I've been thinking a lot about our training exercises and the conversations we've had about expertise and specialization. Today drove it home in a way that all the theory in the world couldn't." Sarah could see the conflict in Morrison's expression. As a professional pilot and officer, he understood the implications of what he was saying. The official policy was that F-16s could successfully assume the close air support mission with appropriate training and equipment upgrades. But the reality was that some missions simply couldn't be completed effectively without the right aircraft and the right expertise. "Captain Morrison, what happened today wasn't a failure on your part or your wingman's part. You were asked to complete a mission with the wrong tools under impossible conditions. The fact that you recognized the limitations and called for appropriate support probably saved lives." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. The problem is, in 18 months when the A-10s are retired, there won't be appropriate support to call for. Marines in situations like this one will have to depend on F-16s regardless of weather, terrain, or tactical circumstances. Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation while continuing his inspection. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of combat experience. "Gentlemen, if you'll forgive an old sergeant for speaking out of turn, I've seen what happens when politicians make decisions about aircraft capabilities based on budget considerations instead of combat effectiveness. People die. Good people, people with families and dreams and everything to live for." Morrison looked at Rodriguez with interest. "What do you think the solution is, Sergeant?" "The decision has already been made at the highest levels." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Morrison. "Sir, decisions can be unmade if enough people with the right kind of influence understand what's at stake. The question is whether anyone with that kind of influence is willing to listen to the people who actually do this job." After Morrison left to file his own mission reports, Sarah found herself alone with Rodriguez as they completed the damage assessment. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the flight line. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" Sarah said as they finished their paperwork. "Of course, Captain. Do you really think there's any chance of reversing the retirement decision? Or are we just fighting a battle that's already lost?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying the aircraft that had brought Sarah home safely despite taking multiple hits from enemy fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful but determined. "Captain, I've been in the military long enough to see a lot of stupid decisions get made and, then, quietly reversed when reality set in. The problem is, usually it takes a disaster to make people pay attention. Maybe what happened today, with the F-16s being unable to complete the mission, will be enough to make some people think twice. Maybe it won't." Sarah nodded, understanding the uncertainty that Rodriguez was expressing. Change in military policy was always difficult, especially when it involved admitting that previous decisions had been wrong. But, sometimes, when the consequences were serious enough, even the most entrenched positions could be reconsidered. "What I can tell you for certain," Rodriguez continued, "is that every day the A-10 proves its worth is another day we can point to when people ask whether retiring this aircraft is really the right decision. Today was a good day for that argument." As Sarah walked back toward the operations building to complete her mission debrief, she found herself thinking about the larger implications of the day's events. 12 Marines had been extracted safely, and the mission had been completed successfully, but at what cost? How many more missions like this one would F-16 pilots be asked to attempt? How many would end differently because the right aircraft and the right expertise weren't available? The debrief session was more extensive than usual, with several senior officers asking detailed questions about the mission parameters and the specific challenges that had made it unsuitable for F-16s. Sarah answered honestly, explaining the weather conditions, the terrain considerations, and the tactical requirements that had made low-altitude visual identification essential to mission success. When the questions finally ended and Sarah was free to leave, she noticed that one of the officers had been taking extensive notes throughout the session. As the room emptied, he approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Captain Chen, I'm Colonel Anderson from Wing Headquarters. I've been tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of the A-10 retirement timeline in light of recent operational experiences. Would you be available for a more detailed interview tomorrow?" Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to provide any information that might be helpful." "Excellent. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of the training timeline for F-16 pilots to assume close air support responsibilities. Based on today's mission and your experience training F-16 pilots, do you believe the current 6-month transition plan is adequate?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Sir, I believe that 6 months provides basic familiarization with procedures and systems. But, developing the expertise needed for complex close air support missions in challenging conditions requires significantly more time and experience." Colonel Anderson made a note on his clipboard. "How much more time?" "In my opinion, sir, a minimum of 2 years of intensive training and operational experience. And that's assuming ideal conditions with experienced instructors and comprehensive curricula. Even then, there would be capabilities that F-16s simply can't match due to fundamental design differences." As Colonel Anderson left to continue his review, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in a position of authority was finally beginning to understand what would be lost when the A-10 was retired. Whether it would be enough to change anything remained to be seen, but at least the conversation was beginning to happen at the right levels. The next morning brought news that would change everything. As Sarah arrived for her morning briefing, she found the squadron buzzing with rumors and speculation. Word had come down from Washington that a comprehensive review of the A-10 retirement timeline had been ordered by Congress, prompted by reports of operational challenges during the transition period. Sarah felt her heart race as she absorbed the implications. It wasn't a reversal of the retirement decision, but it was an acknowledgement that the current plan might need to be reconsidered. For the first time in months, there was a possibility that the voices of the pilots, maintainers, and ground troops who understood the A-10's unique capabilities might be heard by the people who made policy decisions. Whether that possibility would become reality remained to be seen. But, as Sarah prepared for another day of training missions and transition planning, she felt renewed purpose in her mission to preserve and pass on the expertise that the A-10 community had developed over decades of combat operations. The fight to save the Warthog was far from over, and Sarah Chen intended to be part of it until the very end. 6 weeks had passed since Colonel Anderson's review began, and Sarah could sense a shift in the atmosphere at Bagram. Where there had once been resignation and quiet acceptance of the A-10's fate, now there was cautious optimism mixed with nervous energy. Rumors flew daily about congressional hearings, Pentagon reviews, and high-level meetings where the future of close air support was being debated. Sarah was in the middle of a training flight with Morrison when the call came through that would change everything. Hawkeye 1, this is Control. You have an immediate real-world tasking. Proceed to grid reference Delta 4 for close air support mission. Marines in contact, heavy casualties reported. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as she acknowledged the mission and began coordinating with Morrison, who was flying as her wingman in an F-16. It had become standard practice to pair A-10s with F-16s during the transition period, allowing the F-16 pilots to observe and learn from actual combat operations. Viper 2, Hawkeye 1. We've got a real-world mission. Stay with me and observe, but don't engage unless I specifically request support. Hawkeye 1, Viper 2. Copy that. I'm with you. The flight to the target area revealed a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. A Marine unit had been conducting a patrol near the Pakistani border when they were ambushed by a large enemy force. Unlike the previous engagements Sarah had handled, this attack involved sophisticated tactics and heavy weapons that pinned the Marines down in terrain that offered minimal cover. Groundhog 7, Hawkeye 1. I'm approaching your location. What's your tactical situation? The response came back immediately, and Sarah could hear the stress and desperation in the ground controller's voice. Hawkeye 1, we've got 40 Marines pinned down by approximately 100 enemy fighters with mortars, RPGs, and coordinated small arms fire. We've taken heavy casualties and are critically low on ammunition. Enemy forces are moving to flank our position and we estimate 15 minutes before we're overrun. Sarah felt her blood run cold. This was the kind of desperate situation where every second counted and there was no room for error. As she approached the target area, she could immediately see the scope of the challenge. The enemy had positioned forces in multiple locations around the Marine position, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement impossible. Worse, they were using indirect fire weapons that allowed them to attack the Marines from concealed positions. Groundhog 7, I have visual on your position. This is a complex engagement with multiple enemy groups. I'm going to start with the mortar positions, then work on the flanking forces. Stand by. Sarah began her attack runs with the precision and intensity that came from years of experience in exactly this type of mission. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon proved devastatingly effective against the enemy mortar positions, which had been set up in the open to provide the range and flexibility needed for indirect fire. Within minutes, the mortar attacks on the Marine position had ceased. But, as Sarah moved to engage the flanking forces, the situation became dramatically more complex. The enemy fighters had learned from previous engagements and were using sophisticated camouflage and movement techniques that made them extremely difficult to identify and target. Even with her low-altitude visual reconnaissance capabilities, Sarah found herself having to make multiple passes to identify and engage each individual target. Viper 2, Hawkeye 1. I'm having difficulty with target identification due to enemy camouflage and movement. Can you provide overwatch while I work through this systematically? Hawkeye 1, Viper 2. I'm at 15,000 feet with a good overview of the area, but I can't see individual targets through the terrain and vegetation. How can I assist? Morrison's response highlighted one of the fundamental limitations of high-altitude operations in complex terrain. His F-16's sophisticated sensors could provide general situational awareness, but they couldn't replace the detailed visual identification that close air support required. As Sarah continued her methodical attack on the enemy flanking forces, she became aware that time was running out. Despite her efforts, the enemy was continuing to move closer to the Marine position, and it was becoming clear that the Marines would be overrun before she could eliminate all the threats. Groundhog 7, Hawkeye 1. I need you to mark your exact position with smoke and prepare to move your casualties. I'm going to have to get much closer to the enemy positions to stop this flanking movement. Hawkeye 1, be advised that enemy positions are within 50 meters of our location. Any closer and you'll be in extreme danger from small arms and RPG fire. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would have been impossible in any aircraft other than the A-10. She was going to conduct ultra-low altitude attack runs, literally flying between the friendly and enemy positions to provide the precise fire that was needed to break up the enemy advance. Viper 2, Hawkeye 1. I'm going down to the deck for close-range engagement. Maintain overwatch and be prepared to provide suppressive fire if I get into trouble. Hawkeye 1, Viper 2. Are you sure about this? That's awfully close to enemy positions. Viper 2, I don't have a choice. If I don't stop this flanking movement right now, those Marines are going to be overrun. Sarah's next series of attack runs were conducted at altitudes between 100 and 300 feet, flying directly over the battlefield at speeds slow enough to allow precise target identification and engagement. The A-10's armored cockpit and robust design allowed her to operate in this environment, but the risk was enormous. Enemy fire was constant and intense, with RPGs exploding close enough to shake her aircraft and small arms rounds striking her titanium armor with metallic pings that she could hear over the engine noise. But the ultra-low altitude attacks were devastatingly effective. Sarah was able to place 30mm cannon fire with surgical precision, eliminating individual enemy fighters without endangering the Marines who were often less than 20 meters away. The psychological effect on the attacking forces was immediate and profound. Seeing their comrades being systematically eliminated by an aircraft that seemed immune to their return fire broke their coordinated advance and sent them scrambling for cover. Groundhog 7, Hawkeye 1. Enemy flanking movement has been stopped. Can you provide an assessment of remaining threats? Hawkeye 1, outstanding work. Enemy forces are withdrawing to the north. We're clear to begin casualty evacuation. As Sarah pulled up from her final attack run, she felt the satisfaction that came from a successful mission, but she also felt something else. Her aircraft was responding differently, and several warning lights had illuminated on her instrument panel during the intense low-altitude engagement. Viper 2, Hawkeye 1. I'm showing some system malfunctions after that engagement. I may need you to take a look at my aircraft and assess any visible damage. Morrison maneuvered his F-16 into formation with Sarah's A-10 and began a detailed visual inspection. What he saw shocked him. Hawkeye 1, I'm seeing significant battle damage to your aircraft. Multiple impact sites on the fuselage and wings, damage to your vertical stabilizer, and what appears to be hydraulic fluid leaking from your left engine area. Sarah checked her instruments and confirmed Morrison's assessment. The A-10 had taken a beating during the ultra-low altitude attacks, but it was still flying and all critical systems were functioning. It was exactly the kind of battle damage that would have been catastrophic in most aircraft, but the A-10's design philosophy of survivability and redundancy meant that she could continue operating and make it safely back to base. Viper 2, I'm still mission capable for the return flight. Let's head home. The flight back to Bagram gave Morrison a first-hand demonstration of the A-10's legendary toughness. Despite significant battle damage, the aircraft flew normally and landed without incident. As they taxied to the parking area, Morrison could see maintenance crews gathering to assess the damage, their expressions mixing concern with professional admiration for an aircraft that had once again brought its pilot home despite taking punishment that would have destroyed most other planes. Rodriguez met them at the aircraft with his usual clipboard, but his expression was more serious than Sarah had ever seen it. As she climbed down from the cockpit, he immediately began pointing out the various impact sites and damage areas. Captain, you took at least 30 hits from small arms and 2 near misses from RPGs. Engine intake damage, hydraulic system punctures, flight control cable damage, and more holes in the wings and fuselage than I can count without a detailed inspection. Morrison, who had been listening to Rodriguez's damage assessment, looked at Sarah with an expression of amazement. In an F-16, any one of those hits could have been catastrophic. How is this aircraft still flyable? That's what the A-10 was designed for, Sarah replied. The entire aircraft is built around the concept of survivability in a hostile environment. Every system has backups, every critical component is protected or redundant, and the pilot sits in a titanium bathtub that can stop cannon fire. As the maintenance assessment continued, word of the mission began to spread throughout the base. 40 Marines had been extracted safely from what could have been a catastrophic defeat, and the engagement had been conducted under conditions that would have been impossible for any other aircraft to handle successfully. Later that evening, Sarah was surprised to receive a call requesting her immediate presence at Wing Headquarters. When she arrived, she found Colonel Anderson waiting for her along with several other senior officers she didn't recognize. "Captain Chen, please have a seat," Colonel Anderson began. "We need to discuss today's mission and its implications for our ongoing review of the A-10 program." Sarah sat down, wondering what aspect of the mission was causing such high-level interest. "Captain, we've received detailed reports about today's engagement, including damage assessment photos and testimony from Captain Morrison about the ultra-low-altitude attack runs you conducted. What you accomplished today was remarkable, but it also highlighted something that we need to address immediately." One of the unfamiliar officers spoke up. "Captain, I'm General Harrison from the Pentagon. I've been tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of close air support capabilities across all service branches. Today's mission provided a real-world demonstration of capabilities that our current transition plan simply can't replicate." General Harrison paused and looked directly at Sarah. "The ultra-low-altitude engagement you conducted today, could an F-16 pilot have accomplished the same mission?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "Sir, the specific tactics I used today required capabilities that are unique to the A-10. The ability to operate at extremely low altitudes in a hostile environment, to absorb battle damage and continue operating, and to provide sustained precision fire in close proximity to friendly forces, these aren't things that can be easily replicated by other aircraft." Captain Morrison provided a similar assessment, Colonel Anderson added. He stated that attempting the same tactics in an F-16 would have been suicidal, and that even with perfect execution, the F-16's speed and altitude requirements would have prevented the kind of precise engagement that saved those Marines. General Harrison made notes on his clipboard before continuing. "Captain Chan, in your professional opinion, how many similar situations might arise where only A-10 specific capabilities would be sufficient to prevent significant friendly casualties?" "Sir, based on my experience, I'd estimate that approximately 30% of close air support missions involve circumstances where the A-10's unique capabilities provide significant advantages over other aircraft. In complex terrain, bad weather, or situations requiring prolonged engagement with targets in close proximity to friendly forces, there really isn't a substitute." The room was quiet for a moment as the officers absorbed the implications of what Sarah was saying. Finally, General Harrison spoke again. "Captain, I want you to know that your testimony, along with the documentation from today's mission and similar incidents over the past few months, has contributed to a significant reassessment of the A-10 retirement timeline. There are discussions taking place at the highest levels of government about whether the current plan serves our national security interests." Sarah felt her heart race, but she forced herself to remain professional. "Sir, I appreciate being informed about the review process. Is there anything else I can provide to assist with the assessment?" "Actually, yes," General Harrison replied. "We're organizing a comprehensive demonstration for congressional and Pentagon leadership next month. We want to show them exactly what the A-10 can do, and what would be lost if the aircraft were retired. We'd like you to be one of the primary pilots for that demonstration." As the meeting concluded and Sarah walked back across the base, she felt a combination of hope and nervous energy that she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since the retirement announcement, it seemed possible that the decision might be reconsidered based on operational realities rather than budget projections. Over the following weeks, preparations for the congressional demonstration intensified. Sarah found herself working with a team of pilots, maintenance personnel, and training specialists to design scenarios that would clearly illustrate the A-10's unique capabilities. The goal wasn't just to show that the A-10 was effective, but to demonstrate that its retirement would create genuine capability gaps that couldn't be filled by other aircraft. Morrison had become one of the most vocal advocates for reconsidering the retirement decision. His first-hand experience observing A-10 operations in combat had convinced him that the transition plan was fundamentally flawed, and he had submitted detailed reports outlining the specific missions that F-16s simply couldn't accomplish effectively. The politicians keep talking about cost-effectiveness and technological advancement, Morrison said during one of their planning sessions. But they're not considering the cost of failed missions, friendly casualties, or strategic objectives that can't be achieved because the right capabilities aren't available. Rodriguez had also become involved in the preparation effort, documenting the maintenance and survivability advantages of the A-10 design. His 15 years of experience maintaining the aircraft provided compelling evidence that the A-10's operational availability and battle damage tolerance were crucial factors in mission success rates. When politicians talk about cost per flight hour, they're not factoring in mission completion rates or aircraft availability, Rodriguez explained to the planning team. An A-10 that's been shot up can usually be repaired and back in service within hours or days. Other aircraft with the same level of damage would be total losses. The day of the congressional demonstration finally arrived, and Sarah found herself standing on the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, surrounded by politicians, Pentagon officials, and military leaders whose decisions would determine the future of close air support for decades to come. The demonstration scenarios had been carefully crafted to showcase the A-10's capabilities without being so obviously biased as to undermine the credibility of the presentation. Real-world situations based on actual combat missions were recreated, allowing the observers to see exactly how different aircraft performed under identical conditions. Sarah's portion of the demonstration involved a complex rescue scenario where friendly forces were pinned down in mountainous terrain by enemy forces using concealed positions and sophisticated tactics. The weather conditions were marginal, the terrain was challenging, and the tactical situation required precise coordination between air and ground forces. As Sarah brought her A-10 down to 500 feet and began the methodical process of identifying and engaging targets while coordinating with simulated ground forces, she was aware that every move was being watched and evaluated by people whose understanding of close air support came primarily from briefing slides and budget documents. The demonstration was flawless. Sarah and her fellow A-10 pilots showed exactly what the aircraft could do in situations where precision, survivability, and sustained engagement were critical to mission success. When F-16s attempted the same scenarios using current transition protocols, the limitations became obvious to even the most technically uninformed observers. Following the flight demonstration,